Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Autism Confidential. My name is Jackie Kancir. I'm your host this evening. I'm the Executive Director for the National Council on Severe Autism. My guest today is Jonathan Machnee. Jonathan is an adult with level 1 autism, a former military intelligence officer, and has a graduate background in counterforensics. Jonathan spent close to a decade inside the neurodiversity movement and was a true believer. As the author of the Substack, Disparities from the Autism Wars, and as the host of the podcast, Christianity on the Spectrum, he works the seam between theology, disability, and autistic life. So buckle in. Today is sure to be an outstanding conversation, and we are grateful to be able to bring it to you today. Thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the invite. Just for your audience, a point of clarity. When my podcast is almost exclusively about ASD1 or level 1 autism. So just to make the scoping clear, when I say autism in my podcast, I'm almost exclusively referring to ASD1. I have a few episodes where I talk about my research, my brief foray into research with ASD2 and 3, and I had Amy Lutz on one of my podcasts to talk about her book, Chasing the Intact Mind. But just to manage expectations, if you go into my podcast expecting anything else, it is mostly level 1 stuff.
Well, I really have deep dove into your podcast in the past week, and I can tell you there's a lot of really great things on there as well for those of us in our community with the higher support needs. So I definitely still recommend it. I think everyone will find it quite edifying. It's an amazing podcast. You're doing really good work there.
Thank you so much.
I reached out to you because of Substack. I found your Substack and I said, this is somebody we need to have a broader conversation with. Here in Autism Confidential, we kind of hit the hot topics that might be taboo or not so mainstream. And your Substack is right on brand for that. So I really appreciate it. So let's start with the work itself. With Dispatches from the Autism Wars, that's a deliberate posture, not just a Substack title. What kind of work is this for you? And what do you think good autism discourse should look like in today's world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I came up with the name from a joke I had with a bunch of my friends who, I was doing my Christianity on the Spectrum podcast, and I have a bunch of people who are pretty much just like me, and we all talk about this type of thing behind the scenes. And we were like, we should do a podcast about the wild world of neurodiversity activism and the autism wars that we've all been a part of more or less for the last 15 years. And we jokingly said we're going to call it Dispatches from the Autism Wars, but none of them actually wanted to do the podcast in the end. And so I said I'm going to steal it and make it my Substack title because I think it's kind of funny. We talk about the autism wars and joke about the autism wars, and I find myself as sort of doing what I used to do in war, which is analyze the battlefield, look at the different factions at play, and produce intelligence reports on what's going on with them, how are they acting, what are their motivations, where are they moving, and sort of do that high-level sociological analysis of what's going on. And so the Substack is a combination of a dumping ground for those observations that I've made, and also, sometimes I just like to post things that I find funny on it. So you'll find an article where I tell a story about how I was mentoring teenage autistic boys, all with level 1 autism, and had to convince them not to talk to their classmates about why they should be morally compelled to eat their dog once it dies, and the sort of interesting scenarios that I got up to in my mentoring of autistic teenagers and things like that. And then just other topics that get brought up to me a lot that don't really make a nice podcast episode or wouldn't really make sense in a podcast episode. I'll just throw something together and put it up there. So that's sort of where I'm coming from in this. Like you said in the intro, I was super into the neurodiversity movement. So I joined up in it when I was 16. I was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome at the time, and I was described by the person who assessed me as like the most stereotypical case of Asperger's that I've ever seen. So that was it was far back enough that it was still called Asperger's. So I was diagnosed with that, and then immediately I went online to look for other people who were diagnosed with Asperger's, and I found the neurodiversity movement. And I enthusiastically joined up and then basically bought hook, line, and sinker into the neurodiversity activist paradigm for a very long time. And through what is mostly a combination of the training that I did as a military intelligence officer, started to actually analyze what is actually going on. Is the theory that we're being taught actually matching up with the things I was finding on the ground? And I found that they weren't really lining up nearly as well as I had thought. And so I left that. But autistic people often develop specific narrow restricted interests, and mine, for whatever reason, has been online autistic subcommunities. And particularly, I'm always very interested in the sort of sociology and anthropology of religion. And so my initial research was just on online Christians, autistic subcommunities and ex-Christian subcommunities. And that then more broadly led to doing wider analysis of the online autism wars and doing a retrospective on it in a way that I hadn't done before, because I was fighting diligently on one side of it and hadn't really stopped to consider if I was making the right actions or what we were actually doing, what our goals actually were. And so then I've been doing retrospective analysis on that and trying to think through all of that time in my life, because my goal with all of my research projects is to help other people who were like me. And I find most of them go to the neurodiversity movement. And I think we need better ways of thinking about autism, more complex, more nuanced ways of thinking about and talking about autism that actually respect the complexity of what we have labeled autism. And I just find that complexity was lacking in the neurodiversity movement, and that what we need is to maybe inject some more of that complexity and nuance back into these conversations. And so that's sort of what I'm attempting to do there, to varying degrees of success, I'll say.
I think it's fantastic. And that's, a huge reason why I connected with your work and reached out to you, because I too come from a very similar background. My roots really being in kind of the foreground of the social justice, disability rights era, which looked very different back in the 90s than it does today. A lot of times I look at it today and almost see an inversion in some ways of what the original intent was, and kind of our values and our ethics and our goals of what we were trying to achieve. And it's very challenging navigating that today. I think there's a lot of younger families, obviously, now coming into the space, as well as younger individuals growing up and getting an autism diagnosis. There's a lot of historical context that is missed now. If you get a diagnosis today, it's very easy to kind of have a revisionist history and not necessarily look at it as what we knew back in 1990, 2000, 2010, how quickly this landscape has changed over time. I'm not so sure that whether it's the neurodiversity movement or social justice and disability rights, I don't think they've kept up with the pace. And I've been very disappointed in how it's transformed. And I could be completely wrong, but I feel my ethics haven't changed. I feel that I'm still fighting to this day for dignity and the individual human rights that are inherent for each person. But I feel like there's been a separation from that with the original movements I was in. So for those new families and the new individuals coming into this, you are very astute on the history of the neurodiversity movement. So would you like to kind of give us a recap of the inflection points in the neurodiversity movement for somebody who maybe comes online now and is like, autism wars, what are these people fighting about? Why is everybody so passionate on these things? What's the history here?
Yeah, so there is no way I can give the full complete view of this. So just keep in mind this is the sort of top level overview. So there are many disputes about neurodiversity and its origins that are far too boring to relitigate on this podcast. But the overview of it is most people trace its origins to Jim Sinclair giving his "Don't Mourn for Us" speech at an autism convention in the early 90s. Jim Sinclair gives this speech, and the speech is titled "Don't Mourn for Us," and it is addressing the parents of children with mostly severe autism or profound autism at the time, who were the ones getting the diagnoses. And Jim Sinclair himself was a autistic person, but there are a bunch of autistic people at the time who were diagnosed with autism, were minimally verbal in early childhood, and then quickly acquired speech later on. Like this is a known pathway of autism development. And so there were, by that time, a bunch of people who had received the diagnosis who were now starting to talk about autism from the perspective of adults. And one of the things he was trying to push against was a sort of doomer idea of autism, where you had people who were mourning the loss of the child that they had, and he was saying, don't mourn for the child that you wish you would have had, celebrate the child that you do have. And it was received to various degrees of success. And, for a lot of people, they said this is absolutely tone deaf. You are not like our children. And at the same time, a lot of the autistic adult contingent started to rally around that and to say, yes, this is how we should be thinking about autism. We need better and new ways of thinking about it. And so at the time, there were a lot of people coming in from the disability rights side of things, and wins from the Americans with Disabilities Act and all those types of things were coming up. And you had this broad wave of disability rights activism. A bunch of these people started to bring in autism into the mix, right? And so there was this idea called neurodiversity, which is claimed to have been coined by, I think, 3 different people. Who exactly coined it doesn't matter. But what the fundamental idea is that you were taking the social model of disability, which is a specific model and lens through which you understand disability, which was initially developed for people with physical disabilities, to say, okay, how about we stop looking at our disability as a specific impairment or a thing that's wrong with our body, and start looking at society as a whole and start asking questions like, am I disabled because my legs don't work? Or am I disabled because I can't get into the building because you guys didn't put wheelchair ramps there? And these are like good and legitimate questions to be asking, and they have a lot of merit. This framework was basically one-to-one ripped and replaced and applied to neurodevelopmental disorders like autism. And so this is sort of the framework out of which the neurodiversity movement emerges in the 90s. And you have a bunch of autism organizations led by autistic adults. Most of the time, these autistic adults were what we would now call ASD1. So we were either high-functioning autism, PDD-NOS, which is pervasive development disorder, not otherwise specified, which was sort of a bucket you got thrown into if you didn't quite meet all the criterias for autism.
My brother had that diagnosis. Yes.
Yeah. And so you got PDD-NOS, you had high-functioning autism, and you had the largest contingent, which was Asperger syndrome. And these are, of course, all milder forms of autism or lower support needs, whatever terms you want to use. I'm not too particularly bothered by that. I know
We're not the language police. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Neither am I. I find those things quite tedious. But we had this contingent of people who thought we need to rethink the way that we think about autism, applying these new models. And so ANI was formed, which was the I forget what it stands for. It was an organization for
the Autism Network International, I think.
Yes, Autism Network International. We started doing retreats like Autreat in the early 2000s. Autism specific forums like Wrong Planet started popping up, where autistic people who were largely, early tech adopters started using the internet. And I'll also say, important to this, the early adoption of the internet was also for parents with children who had profound autism, where they met each other to talk. And so in this, you started to have these two extremely online factions start to emerge. You have the parents of children with severe disabilities, and then you had people who were grouped into the same neurodevelopmental disability class, who were on the more mild end of the spectrum, and both were competing for who got to define what autism was, right? And who got to say what this disorder was. On the one hand, you have the people who are doing a quest for the cure. And on the other hand, you have people who are saying there's nothing wrong with us. There's nothing to cure here. What we need is for society to be more tolerant of us. And so this is where, Autism Speaks pops up, and you have that, and that became the big boogeyman for the autism self-advocates or the neurodiversity movement side of things. And so neurodiversity was originally conceptualized to include a very broad scope of people, but actually practically on the ground, it was mostly people with high functioning autism or high functioning variants of autism or things pretty close to it, right? It was mostly coming from that. And so the ideas of what neurodiversity is, how it should be thought about, and how these frameworks should be applied were basically being filtered through the lens of people like me. Then Asan or Asan, I don't know. I hear lots of people pronounce it different ways. They were founded as the first NGO political arm. I guess, there were others before it, but it became the biggest one. So that was founded there largely to counter the Autism Speaks narratives of autism. And then lots of things started happening. The biggest one is the DSM. DSM-5 came out, and that sort of had the diagnostic squish of taking all these different categories of autism and putting them under one label. And there were some legitimate arguments for why we should do that. By the time you got to age 18, if you had PDD, NOS, if you had Asperger's, or if you had high functioning autism, you all had the same thing, right? There was virtually no differentiation for you at those ages when you got to that developmental period. And so it's why do we have three different names for conditions that are essentially identical? The only difference between a high functioning autism and an Asperger syndrome was did you acquire speech before the age of 5 or not? And if you didn't, you were high functioning autism. If you did, you were Asperger's. But, when you're 18, does this distinction really matter? And it did for insurance purposes, for getting insurance, for getting people treating you seriously, for your needs getting met, for you to get access to social workers, those types of things. Often your diagnostic category mattered. And so the idea was to squish all of autism into that. And there were a whole bunch of other reasons. And one of them was that Asan was part of the lobbying arm to change the DSM-5 definition of autism to be expansive and inclusive, because it is part of the neurodiversity movement. And the idea is look, there is nothing wrong with having autism. There is nothing wrong with it being expansive. And we want to make sure that people don't get left behind, because when you have discrete separate groups, people fall into the cracks who, maybe they should have been in group 2, but they got put in group 1. And so now they've lost out on insurance funding, and it gets quite complicated pretty quickly. There were those reasons. And then there were other sort of ideological reasons for wanting to combine these diagnoses, and there were arguments for it and arguments against it. But what is most important to this conversation is that it did happen. And you got all these different variants of autism, like all these different autisms squished into one, which was autism spectrum disorder. And that is, I think, sort of when the tides shifted. So before that point, the narratives about autism were largely those controlled by the parents of people with profound autism. When you thought about what autism was in the 2000s, it was profound autism or something like that. And then the self-advocates started winning the information wars, basically. And DSM-5 is, was that where it changed, or did the change happen first? And then that change helped cascade. And, there are all sorts of different factors and factions who are interested in changing this. It wasn't just self-advocacy, but, the people involved in autism self-advocacy and neurodiversity do claim this as a win and do, talk about how they were there trying to advocate for it. So while the Diagnostic Squish is more complicated and there are legitimate reasons, you get to this point where this happens, and then the self-advocacy side basically starts winning the war for who gets to define autism. And I think a lot of it just happens by inertia when you combine a whole bunch of competing categories, and they often have disparate definitions or desperate definitions that are mutually exclusive from each other. The ones who are going to win are the ones who have the most people, who have the most energy, who have the most time, who are most readily able to to self-advocate, and those who are most palatable, more importantly, because we're talking about an information war here. Just when it comes down to it, it's much more easy to win your activist goals when the people that are advocating for you come from Harvard and have advanced degrees from Ivy League universities. So this takes off. You get the representation of autism in media starts to shift. The way people think about autism starts to shift. And then also the sort of coalition of neurodiversity activists starts growing significantly in the 2010s. And then other political shifts start happening, and autism self-advocacy and neurodiversity gets really tied to a certain style of online progressive politics discourse, which involves a lot of yelling at each other and tone policing and things like that, which I'm sure you're more than familiar with at this point.
Yeah.
And yeah,
never seen
so
any.
yeah, so that basically takes us to where we sort of are now, where the slow turn of who gets to decide what autism is starts to shift in favor of the self-advocates. And now, while I don't think the autism wars are fully over, they've certainly shifted in favor pretty decisively of the neurodiversity activists. Some people will say, not with RFK in charge. But I think this is far more an anomaly. If you still look in most NGOs, it's neurodiversity. I mean, Autism Speaks has neurodiversity affirming language on their page. You have every major organization does neurodiversity washing stuff. You have neurodiversity affirming ABA, which is, for anyone in the neurodiversity movement, sort of like a very weird thing. ABA is sort of the antithesis of what the neurodiversity movement stands for. And now you have neurodiversity affirming ABA. Weird how that happens. So you get the sort of NGO-ifying of autism and activist-ifying of autism. And that brings us sort of where we are today in a somewhat cursed form of discourse where narratives are totalizing and one-sided, and there is just a complete lack of nuance, and anyone who breaks from that nuance is labeled a heretic. And I mean,
yes.
I started to have questions about things in 2016 and immediately found out that, we're not supposed to ask those types of questions. And then in 2018, I sort of formally broke with the movement by I didn't block anyone. I didn't cut ties with anyone. I just started speaking frankly about what I was seeing and my experiences, and they just did it for me. So
yeah. Well, let me ask you about that. When I went through that, because I had invested decades of my life into this cause, there is a lot still with that movement. I'd say 85% or more is like on the surface level here. I agree with this, but it's it's where the nuance and the context and the lack of flexibility to be what they say they are, which is fully inclusive, and I'm not just talking about the neurodiversity movement. I'm also talking about this from broadly anywhere in a disability justice, social justice side of things, is where I had this break. And when I personally went through it, I can remember feeling such a sense of betrayal. My whole community was wrapped around this concept. And then to see that same concept that was built on supposedly inclusion and integration and these things exclude my daughter and see her just kind of as collateral damage. Oh, well, but look at all the progress we've made. Let's just talk about that. That really was something I struggled with. Did you have any kind of emotions regarding this change in your life?
Oh, absolutely. So to throw back to what I was saying earlier, I mostly study religious autistics, right? And I look at religion and the experiences of religion. And a really big aspect of that is deconversion, right? So autistic people are significantly less likely to be religious than their non-autistic counterparts, but we're raised religious at the same rates as everyone else. And so autistic people deconverting from Christianity is very common. And one of the things I noted is that my deconversion from Christianity and my deconversion from the neurodiversity movement emotionally, from like an internal experience perspective, felt pretty similar. They weren't identical, obviously, but it was, the lead up to it was a slow buildup of cognitive dissonance where I can no longer hold in my head the ideas I was supposed to hold as a faithful member of the movement, and then what I was seeing on the ground in reality. And sort of like you said, 85% of it is good, but then there's this final 15%. Like I often describe the neurodiversity iceberg, where floating on the top, you see the top of the iceberg, and it's like, oh yeah, this is cool. Nobody has bad brains. All brains are made different, and we just need society to treat people better. And there are all these sorts of injustices that are done to people with neurodevelopmental disorders. And all those things are 100% true. And then you get to okay, so what are we going to do about it? And some of the ideas are just like, ooh, I'm not sure that's going to work, my friends. Or it includes needing to commit to ideas about autism that simply aren't true. That just do not pass a first contact with reality, right? And this causes a lot of cognitive dissonance, and then eventually you get to a point where you can't handle the cognitive dissonance, and you go through a rapid deconversion spiral. And that's basically what happened with me. And I still have a bunch of friends who are in the movement,
as do I
was with at the time. And I mean, a lot of times they see me as an apostate or something like that, where they'll have friendly conversations with me, but they're like, we know, you think about autism problematically. And yeah, so I often compare it to like religious deconversion because it feels very similar. And like, just from a sociological perspective, it basically is the same thing, right?
Yeah, I also feel almost a sense of responsibility now to, when I see the challenges, to call it out, because there is such tension in this space. If somebody were to speak out on this that didn't live through the history of this, that wasn't ever on the other side of this, then immediately they're kind of attacked that they just don't know, or they just don't understand these concepts. And I think it's important that there are those of us who have lived through this full kind of cycle and say, no, we understand it. We understand it very well. We used to be the preachers of this. And we are concerned that there's a divergence from the actual principles that we're stating. And I, in a lot of ways, am trying to bring the movement back into clarity and reality but it can be interpreted as a heretic of, oh, well, this is an ableist. They're not fully in alignment with what we're saying. And that's absolutely not my intention in it.
Yeah. And like, I still care very deeply about autistic people. From like the whole spectrum of it, I am very concerned with and want to make their lives better. I've just become convinced over time that this is not the best way to do it, and that there are better ways. It's not like everything in neurodiversity is bad or all the ideas are bad. It's that there are a few sort of key points where it's like, I think this is a genuine analytical flaw. And having an analytical flaw like this prevents us from seeing reality, which prevents us from making good decisions. Because if you don't have a good picture of what's actually going on the ground, you can't make good decisions about what's actually happening. Like, I mean, again, this is the sort of military intelligence side bleeding back into my autism analysis, but it feels very similar where, if you're giving a commander bad information on the ground, they're going to make bad decisions with that information. And you sort of, as a person doing the analysis, have the obligation to show them things that they don't necessarily want to see, regardless of whether it is in line with their expectations. And, as a military intelligence guy, there were many situations in which I had to be the guy delivering commanders bad news and saying, I know you think this is what's going on, but let me tell you, this is not actually what's going on. And if we don't course correct, bad things are going to happen. People are going to get hurt and people's lives are going to be lost. And we need to do something about that now. And we need to course correct, and we can course correct. Let's do it. And I feel like I'm basically still doing that job, but just with, nothing military related now.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about social philosophy. You've kind of talked about the social model and the inverse to that. The original was the medical model as a thread throughout our conversation already. A lot of this binary thinking between, well, is it the medical model? And then in response to that, it's the social model. And I mean, then there's the biopsychosocial model, which is kind of more, inclusive of it all, but that's not the choices. The choices are medical model or social model, and that's how these things are formed. So when I was going through, I guess you can say, my own deconversion moment, I really, like I said, I took a step back. I really went back into my roots of just researching and trying to find answers to things, because when everybody is going one way and you're starting to go another, you naturally are going to feel like, well, you clearly are not thinking right, right? Like there's something wrong with your thinking. So I went back into the old thinkers and was just trying to find my place and answer this question of really social justice, disability justice. What is justice? Like, let's start with that basic word. And that really took me down to a place where I landed. I think most is true to my own personal ethics would be the Rawlsian, John Rawls type principles, where we have this veil of ignorance. I know you're familiar with it, but for those listening, if in Rawls' thought experiment here, it's really, in a nutshell, you don't know whether you're going to land in this thought experiment as ASD1 or ASD3, or this is somebody who's a Fortune 500 company owner, whatever it might be. You have no idea where you're going to be. And there was this natural understanding that if you didn't know where you were going to be, then you were naturally going to set up society to benefit the least advantaged first, kind of this triage system. That's not to say that those above the least advantage aren't going to get their supports and services too. It's to say we kind of have this triage system. The problem with current society is we all know where we know where our standing is. We know what our diagnoses are. We know what our life experiences are, what we can and can't do. And so we're making that conscious decision now in these big policy debates from our own lived experience, but not from this lens of what if that wasn't your lived experience? What if you were more disadvantaged? And I grew up in Catholic school, and I feel like that really went more towards that heart of charity and altruism that we were taught in school, to step outside of ourselves and think of the least advantaged. So you're very dug into a variety of different theological principles and different philosophical principles. So does this framing map onto the terrain you've been mapping to, or do you come at it the same issue from, say, a different philosophical angle, like McIntyre or theological anthropology or something else?
Yeah, so I come at this from a bunch of different perspectives, depending on which hat I'm wearing. So, I am really fond of the phrase, and if you listen to the podcast, you will hear me say it more than once: all models are wrong, some are useful. And that's sort of the way I approach things. And so it depends on what sorts of questions I'm asking. From a disability rights and disability justice perspective, I think exactly what you laid out, a Rawlsian framework is the best one that I think we should be going with. Now, Rawls has critiques and everything like that, but I think if we are trying to build a good society, we should apply the test of the veil of ignorance. Like, is this what you would want if you were not born ASD1, but were instead born ASD3? And I just, I have a hard time squaring the neurodiversity framework with a hard yes to that answer. And so from some perspectives, I take that, but other perspectives, I come at it from a Christian philosophical lens, where the Gospels, Jesus says in Matthew, in the parable of the goats and sheep, whenever you did this to the least of these, you did this to me. And keeping that in mind is not only would I want this as a form of self-interest, in that if I was born differently, I would want this as a matter of fairness and justice, but also the fact that even if I'm not in that place, I have a moral duty and obligation to help these people, and not to help them on the terms I want to help them, but to help them on the terms that they actually need help. And so I think those are the sort of two main thrusts that I come at this with. And then there's also, just underlying everything, is a sense of ruthless pragmatism.
Yes.
I am an enemy. I'm an enemy of idealism. If there is one thing that I sort of detest, it is theory crafting in like a hypothetical world where you're like, okay, well, you're not being radical enough, because you should really be committed to these higher principles. And it's like, well, those principles won't work for us right now. And an 80% plan that we can execute today is better than a perfect 100% plan that we can execute 10 years from now. And I would much rather have effective partial solutions that we can implement now in our imperfect world, in our imperfect society, always understanding that things are going to be wrong and that we are going to fail, but that we should fail in directionally useful ways. And we should continuously push towards those ways. One of the examples I give on this is like guardianship abolition, which is one of those policies that I explain to people, and they go, I'm sort of notorious in my friend groups for having this absurdist humor where I say things that are sort of out of pocket, and they usually think that's a joke. They usually think that guardian abolition, or like making sure new intentional communities can't be stood up, or passing laws to make it harder to set up intentional communities, is a part of neurodiversity activism. And I had to be like, no, this is actually what is happening. And I think in a lot of those cases, the reason that is happening is because they're like, well, no, there is a better ideal situation that we could have in the future. When I ask them, like, well, we can't just abolish guardianship. Like, this is a useful and necessary framework that we need today, because unfortunately there are very bad people who prey on the weak and the vulnerable, and we need ways to safeguard and protect them. And sure, not every guardian is going to be perfect, but the person who is most likely to care about a profoundly disabled person is their immediate family and their caretakers. Again, that's not always the case, but look, it's mostly the case. And so we should have this imperfect system that is better than like whatever moonshot thing we're going for in the future. And so, yeah, underlying it all is a sense that we actually need to be doing things right now. There is a quote by a German theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And the quote is, I'll butcher it. It's something like, "It is not sufficient that we bandage the wounds of the people crushed under the wheel of injustice. We must drive a spoke in that wheel." And that's a beautiful sentiment, but also forgets that it is actually necessary that we do bandage those wounds of the people crushed under the wheel as well, right? This isn't a both and situation. And we have to take very seriously the fact that while we might have a future ideal that we want to work towards, it is actually important that we don't screw things up for people in the here and now, and that every plan we're going to commit to is going to fail, right? There is no good plan survives first contact with the enemy. And that applies in disability justice as much as it applies everywhere else. And so we need to keep that in mind, and keep in mind that everything we're going to do is going to have trade-offs. It's going to have drawbacks. And we are going to be in this world in which we are going to have to make hard trade-offs, and that we should keep these things in mind when we are trying to apply those principles, like the veil of ignorance, or that your duty and your obligation towards the most vulnerable.
Yeah, I wish I could just download you and clone you across society.
I think that would be terrible for society for many reasons, but no, I appreciate the sentiment.
This is exactly the message we need to hear. So let's talk about political language. So language has been doing a lot of load-bearing work here, and it's starting to give way. You've written about jingle fallacies and Mott Bailey, and I've written on manipulative underspecification and doublethink modernity. The distortion of language as a propaganda tool is not exactly an obscure topic that people are unaware of, right? That's just tucked away in the halls of academic elite somewhere. This is a weapon that predates the musket, but most people sense it, and yet here we are, right? The autism discourse is just saturated with euphemism, toxic positivity, neutrality language that really smuggles conclusions past the reader's defenses. So we use words like inclusion and justice and liberty and happiness, right? But they're really standing on their own kind of hollow shells. Hannah Arendt said, when we no longer have a common language and no longer regard the same things as true, all dialogue becomes useless, and with it, all action. Huxley said, the propagandist's purpose is to make one set of people forget another set is human. What does combating language neutrality actually look like in a discourse whose stakes are so high? What do we owe the people whose lives ride on the words?
Yeah, great question. And so there are several things to unpack here. So I mean, I did a lot of information warfare stuff back in the day. So this is I was more on the offensive side of things. So I perhaps have perspectives on this that other people might not. But the way that we think about language is, as you said, incredibly important. And I think there are occasions in which tone neutral language is appropriate to use, right? So one of the cases I give where I use neurodiversity affirming language is when I'm talking to children about neurodiversity, because they are not mentally equipped to deal with the very cold, hard realities of neurodevelopmental conditions. And so, this is This is language that I use all the time. When I was mentoring teens, I would use neurodiversity language. It's like, if you're 14 years old and you are being bullied in school and what you need to hear is that you have a superpower, then you have a superpower, buddy, right? I would also say, but like, every superpower has super weaknesses. Like, Superman has kryptonite and your kryptonite is people skills. So let's work on those. So like, it's not always as stilted as that. But yeah, I just think that being able to use as wide a vocabulary as you possibly can is just crucial to analysis and to saying things that are true. I mean, there are several papers that have been published and like guidances that researchers get about what language they are supposed to and not supposed to be using. And I mean, some of it is valid. Like we have words change over time. And so words like mentally retarded used to be the correct euphemism in the 90s, and now that's considered offensive. And so I think it's good that we update that language so that, it doesn't feel dehumanizing and things like that. There's linguistic drift on all sorts of things. And so we should attend to those nuances. But at the same time, you have people who don't want to use very useful and basic shorthand like high and low functioning. Now, I don't know how you feel about those terms, but I think they are a useful shortcut to quickly explaining what's going on with someone. So if I say I'm high functioning, it comes with the implication that I can speak, that I can, engage with you on something, that I can engage in reciprocal conversation, that I will be able to pick up what you're laying down, that I will be able to do things that you ask me to do, and all these sorts of things. It's a useful shortcut. And when we replace it with like low support needs, it's like, well, that's also useful language, but that indicates something completely different, right? It doesn't necessarily indicate if someone has low support needs, are they able to do something that a high functioning person is able to do? I don't know, because it really depends what you mean when you actually use those terms. And so I think both are fine, and we should be able to use both. I mean, people get mad at usage of like challenging behaviors or like maladaptive coping mechanisms, and it's like, what else are we supposed to call this? And
there was just a paper written on this. There was a paper that came out recently on the problem with problem behavior. Is there a problem with problem behavior? I think is what it called, and it was affirming the use of problem behavior, but arguing also that sometimes neutral language isn't neutral. If you're picking your nails off of your body or gouging out your arms, this is a problem. And this is not, it's not saying that you're a problem. It's saying this behavior is a problem. It's a problem for you. It's a problem we need to address so that we can help you.
Yeah, and there are just so many instances of people saying, well, stop using this language and start using this language instead. But the replacement doesn't cover the same range that the term it's supposed to be replacing covered. And so you get this situation in which you have now removed a part of your ability to express what the problem is and just accurately, quickly, and concisely do it.
This is a disorder with communication challenges, and yet we consistently have so much language policing from it's really just ironic, and is it not? This is a huge problem that autistic people complain to me about all the time, because they're like, I can't go into these neurodiversity spaces and just ask questions because I don't know which words I'm supposed to and not supposed to be using. Right.
And it's like, yes, the people with communication deficits should perhaps not be restricted in their communication, maybe have a little more grace for them. But like, even using the term deficit gets people really mad. And like, how dare you say autistic people have deficits? It's like, look, I'm an autism researcher. I've been looking at autistic populations for the last 12 years very seriously. I have done over 620 interviews, long form interviews with autistic people, where I sit down for 90 minutes and we talk back and forth about what they think about various particular issues. I don't know what else to call it when a person has communication difficulties. I have communication difficulties. I don't, and they're like, don't say deficit. That implies that there is some sort of norm that we are failing to meet. And it's like, so what if we are? So what if there is a approximate standard of good communication and we're just not able to meet that because I can't really read nonverbal communication? And that's a problem. And it's a problem that comes up in my life all the time. I have a huge amount of difficulty interpreting a person's nonverbal communication. People communicate like 80% of their communication through nonverbal means. And so I'm missing like 80% of that 80%. And so that just means I drop things, and I drop things that I shouldn't be dropping. And this leads to a lot of very difficult circumstances and situations in which I find myself. And like, what else would you call that other than a deficit? And their answer is, well, you see, there's this thing called the double empathy problem. And it isn't that you have a deficit, it's that you have a different communication style. It's like, okay, I have a different communication style that doesn't work in 98% of the times I try to use it. So what do we call a difference that is maladaptive in 98% of contexts? We call that a deficit. Why are we playing this weird game where we're just not saying what this thing clearly is and not being able to express it? And there's another problem, which I just think is sort of, I don't know what other word to use other than it just feels perverse to tell the parents of people with profound disabilities what words they should be using to express what is very, very difficult situations, and to be like, you can't be sad about this, right? Like the don't mourn for us speech is one of those things that I initially looked at and was like, hell yeah, Jim Sinclair, go team, you get those parents. And now I look at it and I'm like, wow, that is incredibly tone deaf to say to people who have profound disabilities when you don't have profound disabilities, when you are on the least impacted end of the spectrum. Because honestly, it is sad. I don't know what else to say. It is something that you can mourn for if you feel that's appropriate. And telling someone you're not allowed to be sad about this clearly tragic situation, it is perverse. And now, don't get me wrong, people can take it way too far. People can take it to a place where it becomes, you go from toxic positivity to toxic negativity.
Right.
And that also isn't a good solution, but there is middle ground between toxic positivity and toxic negativity that we can work with. And I just think that we should be able to talk about and express things in those ways. Like most of the people who commented on that Substack that I wrote called "I Would Cure My Autism" were supportive, right? But there are a few who weren't, and the few people who weren't, again, it was like maybe 5% of people who were commenting. So overall, it was very well received. I think it would have been far less well received about 5 years ago, but that's another question. But those 5% were like, immediately think of the positives, like why are you framing this as a bad thing? And like, I got called a eugenicist when I very clearly stated I was not in favor of the types of things that could be classified as eugenicist.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you hedge it or how you qualify it. If you are not in script, and this is not only the neurodiversity movement. This seems to be any of these factions of any sort, whether it's political or we're talking sociological right now. It's like there's a script and there's a tribe and there's a camp. And if you come off of that script, then you are automatically excommunicated and labeled as if you are in the other camp. And there's only this binary choice always. And it's quite frustrating for those of us who need that nuance and context to be applied. It feels like there's really no there is no camp for us. We're just in no man's land.
One thing I very frequently say is that, we constantly harp on it. Everyone harps on it. Autism is a complex, heterogeneous condition that has a whole wide variety of expressions and differences. And so we should probably have a vocabulary that is as complex as the condition to properly express what is going on. And not being able to have complex vocabulary that covers the whole spectrum of things that you could be able to say to talk about this very complex and heterogeneous broad umbrella term that we have for autism, it just doesn't make sense to me, right? Like, you should be allowed to talk about what is clearly in front of your eyes.
Well, to be fair, we've been talking about some of the language within the autism wars, but we presently have some heat rising even within our own parent kind of community right now. And so I want to talk about scientific language, because when I was going back through your previous podcast, I was mesmerized by your podcast on critical scholarship. I'm like, this is the argument. And now your previous podcast was on critical scholarship of theology, but I really would love to hear your perspective or recommendations or what on how to better handle this kind of rising that we have within our community. So, and you recently wrote on facilitated communication. NCSA has a position statement on facilitated communication. There's quite the rise, as you know, right now in the community, and questioning whether spelling is facilitated communication or if it's separate. There's a secondary issue as well, and that's on vaccines. And so these two subjects, when I look at it, I don't have a personal stake in either one, because my daughter was nonverbal, but eventually was able to have a mixed communication form, some low text, some high text, some small phrases, a lot of delayed echolalia, and gestures, approximations, whatever. But we communicate, so that's good, right? She would be considered minimally verbal. I remember, though, that first time that she was able to push the button on the AAC and it was answering a question, and it was clearly her responding to that question. And it was that first time I even could really feel that know that there was a thought. I just had tears pouring for me. So I can imagine that same response from a parent. I have a lot of empathy for that. However they're communicating with their child, I have a lot of empathy for that. However, I certainly understand the risks and challenges, the serious problems that facilitated communication has. So there's this balance, right? The same thing goes with vaccines, where you have parents who saw a regression. And prior to the 2013 merge, we had childhood disintegrative disorder. So we've always known that regression was a part of autism. There's a ton of theories on why that might happen, right? Synaptic pruning and all these different things. But again, I don't have a personal stake in this, because I didn't have a child who had regression. I knew prior to 2 months old that she was not developing typically. My daughter now, it took us 16 years. We had quite the long diagnostic journey, but we know that her autism was from a genetic mutation with the SYNGAP1 gene. And so that caused her seizures, that caused her autism, that caused her intellectual disability, it caused all those things. I know the cause. I'm very fortunate to have treatment that is tailored specifically to her cause. And I believe there are many autisms and many causes. So I look at these parents, again, with such empathy, but at the same time, we want to keep our herd immunity, right? And what's happening right now with the measles outbreak and everything is not okay. So these are conversations that oftentimes within our own community get families pretty upset, and we never want to push anybody away. We never want anybody to feel like if you do believe your child was vaccine injured, then you're not welcome here, or if, anything like that. And that's not our stance. But we also feel we have a responsibility to rest on the science that we have to date. I completely feel parents are justified when they get upset hearing phrases like the science is settled. And so
Yeah.
this is where your critical scholarship podcast really caught my attention, because I have signed kind of the same thought process on this issue. I don't slight the parents for this current heat that's rising. I don't slight them for being skeptical and distrustful to the community. I look at this and have really been trying to push researchers to go beyond the publication. That's not where it ends, that they really need to have kind of a strategic plan for PR to ensure that their findings are disseminated and that people know about them and that they're understood. And I don't see that happening. So for me, I think this lands most on the researchers, but maybe, maybe I'm just crazy on that. And so I would like to ask you, how would you apply the methodological humility you've been asking of critical scholarship in theology to this dissidence inside the autism parent community?
Yeah. So I would like to echo a few things that you said there. Like I think that I have an immense amount of sympathy and compassion for the parents of autistic children who are looking for answers and not finding them. That is a existentially horrifying position to be in. And when you start grasping at straws, I find it very difficult in my heart of hearts to blame them for looking for any answers for their children who are very clearly suffering and having a lot of very difficult situations. I have nothing but compassion for them. I think that in the alternative biomedical space, you do have a lot of people who take advantage of that in ways that I am far less compassionate towards, to put it mildly. And and I think like a lot of FC practitioners fall into that space of giving desperate people looking for answers a false hope that isn't there. And so I would like to bracket my answers with saying that while I understand this, I do think unscrupulous people can take advantage of that desperation and that search for answers. And like you said, I don't think so we have this label that we call autism. And because it's one word, people go, yes, this should be thought of as one continuous thing, or we have autism spectrum disorder. And so we imagine a sort of line or, that circle that people trot out. And I don't think that is a particularly helpful way of thinking about autism. One of the counterexamples I give to this is something like Rett's syndrome. So we used to think that Rett's syndrome was either autism or autism adjacent or within this sort of pervasive developmental disorder.
It was under the PDDs in the previous DSM.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then we found that there was a gene sequence specifically for it, like the fragile X gene sequence for it. And then we went, oh, wait, no, sure, like 60% of the people diagnosed with Rett syndrome could also have been diagnosed with autism, but this is actually controlled by this specific gene. And so not autism, just looks like it. The chances that that's the only case of that is, I think, pretty low. I think, like, personally, the model that I use to conceptualize it is more of an autisms, not autism. So, we have the Spark study. Yeah, the Spark study that's recently published found 4 cluster groups, which is like, okay, cool. maybe that's a starting point. And I think sometimes we do a disservice to ourselves by thinking that it's one thing. And we always talk about heterogeneity in autism. That applies to autism at level 1, at level 2, and at level 3. Right now, they are under a broad conceptual label because the only way that we can reliably detect autism is by external behavior clustering, right? We don't have a precise set of biomarkers. There's a lot of confusion. And so the first thing I would emphasize in that is understand that we do not know enough about autism to start making very strong pronouncements about it, right? Autism is still understood. we're getting there. We're making progress in the scientific field, but a lot of times that progress is very difficult to understand and very difficult to contextualize if you yourself are not in the autism research field. And I don't blame people. Like it has taken me a very long time to get to a point where I can like fluidly read genetic studies and understand what's actually being said in these things. And, you know, we have other studies that'll find something in a mouse model that may or may not translate to a human model. And there are treatments in mouse models that may or may not extend to human models. And we have all this complexity. And so in the critical scholarship episode that I did, one of the things I kept harping on is there is just so much that we don't know and that we cannot know. And that we need to temper our expectations of making very hard, firm conclusions about what's the cause of this. Now, in some cases, we will get down to more specific things. So in some forms of profound autism, we can find gene sequences that are related to that particular form of autism, where, you know, a T or a C is flipped, or something like that.
That's actually my daughter's. Yes, a C.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. So you get forms of profound autism where something like that is happening, but also autism isn't something like Down syndrome, which has, you know, the trisomy of the 21st. It's polygenetic, as far as we can tell. There are lots of genetic components, but then there are also environmental components that affect genetics. And you have epigenetics, and you have polygenetic traits that, you know, depending on the combination of polygenetic traits that you have different expressions. And there is so much sort of ambiguity in this very complex space that whenever someone says definitively, like, this is what causes autism, that should immediately raise a little alarm in your head to be a little careful. I mean, you've been in this space for longer than I have, so you've probably seen this happen far more than me. But every 2 years, there's a study that comes out, and it's like, we have a treatment for autism.
Yeah.
That's worked in mice, or that's worked in a small
zebrafish
cohort. Yeah. Or we've got the zebrafish models, guys. We're going to do this. Or like we tested this on the small sample size of 13 and it showed promising results in 6. And then it goes to larger trials, or it goes to human trials, and it just doesn't pan out. And that happens pretty much every 2 years on a loop since I've been following this stuff, right? And so I'm sure you've seen the same thing. And the lesson to take away from that is things are really complicated, and that many of the things that we initially think are true don't hold up. And what we should be doing is taking our ideas about autism and sort of holding them loosely in an open hand, right? To say, this is probably what's happening, but I'm going to update when I get new good quality information. I find that, like, a really frustrating thing with my side of the autism wars is that a lot of people on the ASD1 side are just super tied to very specific narratives of autism. You know, it's purely genetic. It doesn't have any sort of environmental risk factors there. And you know, it's anyone who suggests that there's anything that could cause autism is, you know, doing eugenics or whatever they say. There are all sorts of things like that. And it's like, well, I mean, there are large genetic components to autism. Like, there are heritable autism traits. That's pretty well established at this point. Which traits those are, different question. You know, heritability versus genetic inheritance, also different.
Right.
In important nuanced ways that are a little more complicated to explain. There are many things where, you know, like, I'm basically a carbon copy of my dad, who clearly has Asperger's or ASD1 or whatever you want to call it, but this specific variant of high functioning autism. But the people on my side are like, no, we know what causes it. People should stop freaking out. It's totally fine. Like, there's nothing going on. It's like, well, hold that in an open hand. Be ready to change your mind. And so one thing that happened when the Spark study released is they found that the cluster that is most closely associated with profound autism has the highest level of de novo genetic mutations in it. And so it's like, okay, interesting thing. Previously, a lot of us thought that ASD3 was a largely genetically inherited disorder with a bunch of different things that went down in neurodevelopmental environmental factors. But it's like, well, maybe what the Spark study was showing was that these clusters have very high level of genetic de novo mutations, that this itself could be a better explanation for the sort of heterogeneity that we find within this ASD3 group. And like, again, this is one of those things where it's like, maybe this isn't autism, but autisms, and just hold these conclusions in an open hand. Like when the Spark study came out, I didn't have a model of autism that reflected what the Spark study found. When the Spark study came out, I read through it. I did my due diligence. I spent a lot of time thinking about and digesting it. I emailed a bunch of my friends who do this work because I just from doing this research, I'm friends with a lot of autistic genetic researchers and people who have like the inside scoop on this type of thing. And then I went, okay, time to update my model of autism and what I thought it was. And this didn't cost me anything emotionally because I wasn't too tied to what it initially was to begin with. And so it's like, I just accept that currently we don't know a whole lot. As the years go on, we learn small bits more, but it's small bits more on a sea of unknowing where we are slowly pushing the ball forward one step at a time. And if anyone starts giving you definitive conclusions like this is it, or we know this, be skeptical. Because the chances are in a heterogeneous condition like autism, we're going to have some weird and very complicated results.
That is a hard conversation in our community right now. It's very heated, unfortunately. So
the red chime will sort of throw into everything I just said is that we do have pretty effective methods of determining some things. So when it comes to facilitated communication, I think the message passing test is pretty solid way of determining.
That's what we say all the time. Autism Science Foundation, it has funding right now. They're trying to find, they're like trying to give researchers money saying, we want to study this. We see the phenomena of parents that are, rising up with this. We will give you money if you can do a study with the message passing test, and the money is sitting there. So if you're listening to this podcast and you really believe in spelling to communicate or facilitated communication, we're saying go see Autism Science Foundation. They have money. They want to fund the research.
Yeah.
And if you're right, the science will validate it. And it's very simple with the message passing test.
And so I put out an episode saying that FC is not what it claims to be and that we should be very skeptical of it. I will totally change my entire tune if you just show me the message passing test in the context that I need. Like I am sort of incredibly open to evidence in ways that I find most people aren't, and very willing to update my ideas, even if those are ideas I am strongly emotionally tied to, if you show me evidence that it's not there. So like if you want to show vaccines cause autism, you actually need to do the studies for it. The methods by which you could prove this are pretty well established, right? So there are ways that you show in epidemiology whether something is happening like that or not. We have the methodologies that we can follow to do this. We followed up through those methodologies a lot and haven't found the link, right? It's not like we haven't done the research there. It's that we've done the research and we haven't found the thing that we're looking for. And so while there is still a lot we don't know, there are many things we do know, and there are many things we know how to do. And so we can follow these processes and get answers to like really hyper specific questions, or like in these contexts did this thing happen, especially nowadays with like the amount of data we can get our hands on from all these tracking organizations that are now tracking. This should be a question that is within answerable range, and all you need to do is answer it. Yes.
Yeah, we didn't have the best tracking systems back then, when a lot of these current parents that experienced this regression and are still unjustly still seeking answers to this day of how they had a child that was developing properly and then just something changed. We should have an answer to that 20 years later, and we don't. And that's infuriating. And so I completely agree there. There's a lot of emotion on both sides of that. That's why I kind of hedged it in the beginning, saying, I don't have a personal stake in this. I'm kind of an outsider on it without an emotional attachment. Either way that the science falls, I will, I'll get on board with whichever way it goes.
Same.
But I genuinely have so much empathy for the families that are waiting to hear that first communication, that first interaction with their child who is 32, that had a child that was developing and then just had the lights go out, they say, and it's like, what happened? I want to know those answers too. I do. I want to know those answers.
And as just a final note on this, like I get a lot of people from my side of the autism wars, like kind of making fun of parents for going through a bunch of these experimental treatments, like, hyperbaric chambers and things like that. And I think that's deeply unfair. Like if you had a child that was suffering that much and you thought, even if there was a 1% chance that this worked, wouldn't you try it? I mean, like I am a father. I have a child who I care very deeply about. If she was in the same state that some of these other kids are in, maybe I would try other things just because the situation is so dire. And so I think that a lot of people on my side aren't as compassionate or understanding as they should be, because they think that what the parents are dealing with is basically a copy of them, and it's not, right?
Yeah.
It isn't that at all. And that these are often desperate situations being responded to by desperate measures, and that we should just have a little more compassion and a little more empathy for people who are in much more vulnerable positions and in much worse circumstances. Again, sometimes these things can be taken to very bad extents, as I mean, you and I are both very well aware of. But at the same time, like there are reasons these happen, and the reasons these happen are often because they aren't getting answers, they aren't getting support, and they aren't getting help. And if you genuinely want to combat this and you're on my side of things, the response should not be like mocking and derision of these parents. The response should be a call for better support for these parents, and to get better support programs, deal with things like the caregiver crisis and that type of thing. Like this is the way you should be responding, not by like making fun of people on the internet.
Yeah. And they will say, well, that's what we're doing. We're trying to get better supports, but you're not listening to us what your child needs. And it's like, you've never met my child, so exactly. you don't know what she needs. I don't always know what she needs either, but I promise you I'm probably closer to the mark. But, and that's where there becomes these autism wars. So from where we started, let's circle all the way back as we start to wrap up. And is this a forever war? Or is there a bridge to peace here? And if there is a bridge, what is the crossing structure? I'm asking about the architecture of a synergistic existence across the spectrum, somewhere institutionally, linguistically, and culturally in which an ASD1 adult and an ASD3 adult and an ASD3 caregiver of an adult are all fully visible and none of them is erasing the others. Is that a path possible, or is this a multi-state solution needed?
So I think it is possible with some caveats. So I like to think I am living proof that it is at least possible in some people. That being said, I am not, every autistic person out there, and that autism is heterogeneous. And so you will get some of us who will be able to stand on that bridge. And I think probably more people than you might initially expect. I think the neurodiversity dam on the autism one side, which has been the dominant narrative for understanding autism over the last 15, 20 years on our side, I think cracks are starting to form in it. And, part of my Substack is to maybe push those cracks to be a little deeper. Because one of the most common comments on my blog was, "Thank you for saying this. I'm ASD1 and I feel the same way," if you go through them. Also, the most common DM and email I've received after that. And so I think that for some of us, it is possible, but like all heterogeneous populations, it'll be complicated. I think one of the things that is making it much harder, though, is the fact that we have the term autism. I don't know what the solution here is, right? But
we're willing to give it up. Just so everybody listening, we're willing to give it up. You guys can have it. We don't care what you call it, whether, it.
I have no emotional attachment to it either.
Yeah,
but care. If I am autistic and I am trying to advocate for people like me, and your daughter is autistic and you are trying to advocate for people like her, the things your daughter needs and the things that I need are both real needs, but they are of a scope and scale so wildly different that if we're calling both of these things autism, someone is going to lose, right? Because in this is the battle over guardianship, right? So for a person like me, I do not want my parent to be able to enforce guardianship over me. Right. And I don't think any person who would look at me would think that that's a reasonable thing to do. However, for a person with profound autism, that is a reasonable thing to expect and to want. However, if you say guardianship for all autistic people, that includes me, and that includes someone with very profound disabilities who needs safeguarding and who needs protection. And so that there's going to be a fight, because I don't want my parents to be able to force guardianship on me because I'm an autonomous adult, right? And so we're going to come out on these problems when RFK gave his speech about autism in April of last year, he described profound autism, like some cases of profound autism, right? He said they'll never do their taxes, they'll never play baseball, they'll never have a job, and so on and so forth. And the immediate reaction to that from autism activists at my level was, I'm autistic and I do all these things. And that's always going to happen. Trophy. Right. And that's always going to happen if we're both calling the same thing autism. And so my proposed solution is we keep autism as a sort of broad category, right? Like a broad umbrella term. And we just say, understand that, you use the word cancer, and cancer, I mean, people hate when I use that because they're like, autism's not cancer. I get it.
Yeah, I know.
But whatever. Just bear with this imperfect analogy for a few seconds. For cancer, you have stage 1 basal cell carcinoma, which is like a small little skin cancer that you can basically show up to any dermatologist and they'll just remove it and you're done. Right? They remove it, they send it off to the lab, they go, yep, that was cancer, we got it all out. Maybe they cut a bit more skin off. You are now cancer free. And then you have stage 4 melanoma. These are these are both cancer. They are both wildly different in the state in what you need to do with them, the level of urgency they require, the level of care you will require. And everyone understands that if you have like a stage 1 BCC, it's like, okay, well, like, yeah, you had cancer, but it's not that big of a deal, right? And then, but we also know that stage 4 is very different. So my current usage, I always try to specify which autism I'm talking about. I say ASD 1, 2, or 3. And in my mind, these are discrete categories of different types of people that you can, sure, people can change and shift. And like, there are complexities when you split the spectrum, because especially in early childhood development, it's kind of difficult to tell. Are you a 1? Are you a 2? Or are you a 3? Or are you going to be those when you're 18? It's hard to tell on a 2-year-old. It's hard to tell on a 3-year-old, right? So, maybe we have a different diagnosis for early childhood development, and then, it solidifies later on. I don't know what the solution is. I'm sort of just spitballing here. But so long as me and your daughter share a diagnostic category, even if you and I both have the best intentions, we are accidentally going to start stepping on each other's feet, because there are real practical, pragmatic differences. And we might share things in common, but those things that we share in common are like broad disability rights concerns. So access to insurance provisions and things like that, where sure, we might share some things, but so long as we're both under the same name, I think we're going to be stepping on each other's toes, even if we don't want to, even if we both care about the other person. There is just the conceptual ambiguity is going to unintentionally create scenarios in which you and I and your daughter end up in a competition when we really shouldn't be. Exactly. And I think the easiest thing to do would just be, give them different names, like just hard delineate. I joke about this. I have a joke that we can't go back to Asperger's. So let's go back to a name that will offend no one. Let's just pick two ASD ones and name it after that everyone will get on board with. So let's call it Elon Greta syndrome for Elon Musk and Greta Thunberg. But, I like it. I don't care what you call it.
Yeah, we don't care either.
We need some sort of hard delineation, and understand that within this hard delineation, there are problems with insurances and with coverages that will need to be attended to. And so it's not going to be simple. It's not going to be as easy as that. The Lancet Commission already came out with profound autism. And so that's the term that I use when I'm trying to differentiate. I just say autism and profound autism. But that still itself leaves a lot to be desired. And so I think having some sort of harder linguistic differentiation between these categories, so that when RFK is talking about the rise in autism, we know what autism he's talking about. And when we're saying we want autism interventions, instead of just saying autism interventions, we can talk about the specific category that we're looking at and the specific needs that we're looking at. And it will be an imperfect solution. Like I said, we won't get 100%. It will get us 85% of the way there now, rather than 100% of the way there in 10 years. And then when we get there in 10 years, it'll get pushed back another 10 years, And so as far as I'm concerned, some sort of more intuitive spectrum split, this also affects me. I mean, it doesn't affect me nearly as much as it affects your daughter, but I go to churches to talk about autism and my autism research to try to help people like me who will be going to their churches, and immediately I go, so, I have autism, and they go, no, you don't, because they know someone with ASD3. And that's a very reasonable thing to say. If you know someone with ASD3 and to you, that's what autism is. And then you see this articulate guy with a master's in computer engineering up at the front talking to you about autism, you go, wait a second, that's not the same thing. And so it just makes getting help for people like me harder for people like me. And like, while I think your children should clearly take priority and precedence in the triage queue, I think this would be helpful for all of us in general. So that's so it's like, yeah, I think there's a way that we can get on this bridge, and we can, at least be in an alliance on the issues that we share in common. But before we get on that bridge, I think we need to differentiate and just make it clear that these are, neurodevelopmentally, sure, they can be in the same conceptual space. Sure, we can say they share stuff, but pragmatically and practically, these are different buckets, and we should just be honest about the different buckets.
I don't know that I necessarily agree. It would mean that those with ASD1 would have less services. To me, and I got to tell you, I was a latecomer to the split the spectrum train. I really was, because I had some ethical concerns that, well, for example, when you talk about the difference between you and my daughter, in the middle of that would be my brother, right? And so that's the person I was concerned with the split the spectrum. That those, well, where's level 2 going to go? And are you high functioning level 2 and you're going to merge into 1, or are you low functioning level 2 and then you're going to be considered on 3, but you really weren't? And like, where do we draw that line? And I was so concerned for who was going to get missed in this. But what got me on board with splitting the spectrum was that it already happened, right? Like, if you read Assange's position statements versus NCSA's position statements, I mean, it looks like we live on different planets, because we do. We really do. Yeah. And it's not that their position statements are wrong. For the population that they're serving, these are extraordinarily important positions to have, right? Like, if you are an autonomous adult who has the capacity to make your decisions, you absolutely should not have guardianship. On the other hand, we have these challenges here. If you are somebody who is at extreme risk of exploitation and harm, and if somebody does harm you, you can't say who harmed you or how they harmed you or where they harmed you, and nobody's going to be held accountable. This is somebody whose safety has to be paramount above that privacy. The safety versus privacy thing, I think, is a false dichotomy argument for another whole podcast one day. But that's because we're talking about two completely different populations, right? So our position statements are meant to be very narrow. It's in our name, right? Like, it's meant to be, we are saying this is only for this population. Since the shift has already occurred, to me, it only makes sense that we name it properly. So there is a better allocation of resources. In the military, we don't send the equipment for the Air Force to the Navy and vice versa. Exactly. Like, they need different types of equipment. Sure, some might overlap, right? Like, you're going to have planes fly off the ship. You're going to, but there's, for the most part, we're going to send the aquatic stuff over to the Navy, and we're going to send the air stuff over to the Air Force. And that's just a different allocation of resources, right? They need different things. And that's what it's about for me, is that each person is able to access the types of targeted treatments and supports and accommodations that make sense for them and that they feel good about. And then we wouldn't even be having arguments about, oh, ABA is so terrible. Well, it would be if you're on this side of it, but maybe over here, it's not a guaranteed end all be all solution, but maybe it's something you try if you're over on this side, and that seems to me to end a lot of the battles, maybe not the autism wars in total, but I think a lot of the battles are ended with a delineation that is very clear between the two sides.
Yeah. And like, I agree with that. And I'll echo, like, one of the concerns that I also have with splitting the spectrum is that once you start making hard delineations between different groups, insurance companies will inevitably try to treat them differently and allocate different amounts of resources to them. In Canada, we don't have quite the same problem with our healthcare. And so, I think maybe this is a bit idealistic of me, but one of the things where we could stop the autism wars is on healthcare reforms and making healthcare better and more accessible for us. Because in our current system, I think there is what I call the sorting problem of, you're on the border of 1 and 2. Do you get 1 or do you get 2? And that difference between the 1 or the 2 could be the difference between you getting coverage for a treatment and you not getting coverage for a treatment. And so I think we need to be like cognizant of these types of things and understand that we might be dealing with that. But I also just think if we both call them autism, we're going to have a war over that, right? We are going to have a war between the 1s and the 2s and the 3s for triaging, right? For just basic triage reasons. Even if it's not actual resources, even if we have enough resources to go around, it's who gets the attention, when you say autism, what does the person think about? Because that changes and affects policy. That shapes how lawmakers will make decisions about whether or not we're going to approve intentional communities to be built, or like the restrictions and zoning issues and oversights of these types of things. And so that's another sort of problem. But there's also one more problem, which I didn't talk about, which I'd like to just squeeze in here, which is research has an inertia to it, right? It is publish or perish. And you need to get papers out. And if you have something called autism and you have someone like me in it, or someone like your daughter, one of us is very easily and quickly able to drive themselves to your research place, take the surveys, self-directed, do all the things. I will follow all the instructions you give me. I can diligently track stuff and note stuff down. You need to do autism research. If you are designing a study, which population are you going to choose? The one that's very easy to work with, or the ones that is much harder to work with? Again, not wanting anything malicious happening. Institutions follow paths of least resistance. And if you group a whole bunch of heterogeneous people together, things are inevitably going to go down that path of least resistance. And that's very good for the people in the path of least resistance, but it sucks for everyone else. And so if we instead say, look, there is no path of least resistance, there are just like 3 different paths or 5 different paths or 10 different paths. I don't care how, I don't care how we split things, but just like different paths. So like you said, we can get that resource allocation, the appropriate types of support strategies for the appropriate types of people. Because even if everyone has good intentions, institutions are not ideal things. The way that the world works, the way politics works, are not ideals that execute things perfectly. They're imperfect things that take paths of least resistance. And when you group in a bunch of people that will not give much resistance and a bunch of people who will give a lot of resistance, things are going to inevitably shift to favor them. And like that, I think that's why the autism wars have swung in the way that they have, is just, in a lot of cases, we're the side that is the least resistance, or the loudest and most aggressive, saying we need to be the ones that you service. And so,
there's a social domain disparity here too, right? So you have individuals with level 1 ASD who are the researchers, who are the politicians, who are part of the whole megasphere of how we shape policy and how we shape conversations, and they're the authors and they're the speakers, and it's not just that they're being studied, they are part of the process, versus somebody like my daughter, certainly not, right? And there's such that disparity. Not only is my daughter not, but I mean, I'm very fortunate. Obviously, I am able to work a very remote, flexible position, but this is, the unicorn of jobs, and most families do not have that as an option. And so not only is the individual with level 3 autism often not able to participate in policymaking and research and those kinds of things at that executive level, but then in addition to that, the person caring for them might have been a researcher, might have been in politics, might have been in whatever it might be, but had left that field to provide care for their child that nobody else will. And so that, I think, also has been really attributing to the shift in just societal perception of this, because the voice really has been quelled. And I don't think maliciously. I just think that that's how it happened because of the participation element.
Yeah, no, completely agree.
You just came out recently with your latest piece. It said, if Chapman is calling for resolution and Neiman is calling for reform, I'm calling for reconsideration. So
yes,
let's just end with your vision for reconsideration. When you look out 5 years, 10 years, policy, research priorities, culture, what do you expect is actually going to shift, and what do we need to be doing right now so we're not just bystanders or consumed by whatever that shift might be?
Yeah, so it's very hard to predict what's going to happen because a lot of these are tied up. A lot of these events are tied up in like macro level events. So a good example of this, one of the biggest cracks that first started to form in the neurodiversity movement had nothing to do with what the people in the autism sphere were doing, but had everything to do with the fact that Elon Musk acquired X. And a whole bunch of the people who were active autism activists on X moved to Blue Sky and sequestered themselves on Blue Sky. And that left more conceptual space for people like me to operate. And so like that had absolutely nothing to do with anything autism related. It just sometimes things shift in ways, and that reshapes the terrain and reshapes the landscape. And then people can exploit those gaps that get created and stuff like that. You know, the election of Joe Biden changed things. The election of Donald Trump changed things. The elections of the future will inevitably change things in ways that it's very hard to predict. However, if I had a magic wand and I could wave that magic wand in practical and meaningful ways, I think the first part would be some sort of spectrum split. Exactly what that would look like, I don't know, but just that would be where I think we need to head. I think that has already started with the Lancet Commission. I think that is going to be more feasible with things like the Spark study coming out and giving us genetic clusters. So now we have something harder to hang our hat on, as opposed to, you know, the previous state, which was like, well, I don't know how these things are related to or not. And it's like, well, now we have genetic clusters that we could maybe go with. Again, there are still lots of complications and things like that still need to be addressed. But like that would be an ideal, I think, to move things forward. Other things I would want to see would be broader based reforms. So ones that I think would be important would be, I'm very enthusiastic about being creative about care solutions. So right now we have some pretty weird draconian laws around the care that you could provide to your own family. And, you know, I talk to families and they're like, well, I get paid a certain amount by the government to provide care for my child, but I can't deliver medication under that. And so I have to like clock into this and then clock out, deliver the meds as their mother, and then clock back in to, you know, go back. Ridiculous things like that I would like to see changed, where we move forward together on those broad-based reforms of those types of systems. So that's where, like, ideally I would like to move in the next 5-10 years. So we have a more clear semantic language-based differentiation between these groups. And then once we get that done, we start working on better broad-based reforms, and who knows what's going to happen in between there, right? Like if you would have asked me in 2020, I would have been like, yeah, the neurodiversity movement is probably going to continue to be as dominant as it is in 2020. But I think a bunch of weird stuff happened electorally and in the map of our political landscape that that's shifted. And so I probably wouldn't have ever predicted I would have been publishing those pieces that I published in 5 years ago. But now I feel like, whatever, I can post it now. Nothing bad is going to happen. And so, yeah, that is my vision. It's a very modest vision, I'll say. It's like, yeah, let's semantically differentiate these things so we can more clearly define the problems, and then let's work on solving some of the sort of big ticket issues. And the big ticket issues, I think, are a lot around care and support work reform and those types of things where we can make, I think, really genuine impacts to just make life easier for the families of people. And I mean, it will also help people on the ASD1 side of things. Like a lot of us are on disability, and because we're on disability, like in Canada, if you get too much part-time employment, you lose access to your disability funding.
Same
and that,
here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I personally find that ridiculous, right? Like people are so concerned about people with genuine disabilities defrauding the system. They're like, you're making too much money, we can't pay you. And it's, I don't know, things like that I just find ridiculous. And I think my vision would be to try to change those things. In my reconsideration, it would be, let's split this up into sensible categories, and then let's try to work on these broader based care reforms. I'd also like to see other things happening, like just more funding for people going into care work so that we actually, so that it doesn't all have to fall on the families of disabled people and things like that. So that's kind of my boring policy based vision.
No, it sounds like an NCSA pitch. It really does, and I think that's what's important from conversations like this. I wish there were more of this. I think that we absolutely should have you back on again, because I think this is how we get out of the autism wars. I think having more dialogue is how we kind of squash the very limiting slogans and the rhetoric that's been out there, and just try to infuse more nuance and context into the conversation. I think is the antidote to the negative stuff that's out there right now. Let our audience know what kind of projects you're working on now, or how they can find you, because I'm certain they're going to be, if they haven't already been Googling and figuring out where you are. Where can they find you?
I have a podcast called Christianity on the Spectrum. That is where I do most of my work. It is mostly a podcast about sort of sociological, anthropological analysis of ASD1 online communities of Christians and ex-Christians. That may not be the most interesting thing to other people, but if you are interested in it, I'm so glad to hear that. I always wonder, like, who actually cares about this stuff? I do, but then I find a few people who also do. I also have a Substack where I am currently midway through publishing a 4-part series on critiques of neurodiversity. I wrote a piece called I Would Cure My Autism, which was sort of my opening foray into giving a sustained critique of the neurodiversity movement. So you can check that out. You can find me on X at Christianity On. You can find me on Blue Sky at christianityon.bluesky.social. You can email me christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. I will warn you, I don't have much specialty in ASD 2 or 3. I intentionally scope limit myself to ASD 1 because that is the section of the population I'm most familiar with and most able to help. So I wish I could help you more, but I just can't. And I would love it if we could make life easier for people like you. But I think that goes far beyond my specialty and my ability, and that my job right now is to help the people on this end of the spectrum to free up resources for other people on the other sides of the spectrum. So, and to make it easier for us. And also a big part of my project is trying to convince people on my end of the spectrum to become conscientious objectors in the autism wars. So that's another thing.
We are kindred spirits there. I'm working on it on my side too, I promise. But, it's just, and that's why we try to bring this expansive perspective into the conversation and really push ourselves outside of echo chambers. Maybe there's some middle ground, and I think more of us are starting to rise up. They're just not as vocal yet.
I think so too. Just from my own anecdotal experience, I wish I had much better data on this. But from my own anecdotal experience, I find that a lot of people on the ASD1 side are looking for alternative narratives about autism and how to think about autism that is more complicated and nuanced, and I find a lot of people are receptive to it. So I think that appetite exists, and so I'm personally cautiously optimistic, and I hope that this helps in some way to bridge that gap as far as we can. I don't think we need to be enemies, right? I don't think there is a good reason for us to be fighting about things. We do have common interests. We should be working together on those common interests, and where we don't have common interests, we should stop trying to force common interests, right?
Yes.
And so what we have in common, let's work together on.
We just need to find a way to kind of lower the temperature on the whole situation. And I think that hopefully maybe one person listening tonight, it does that. Or maybe we just rile them all up on both sides. We'll see how this goes. Hopefully it's for the good. That's what my purpose is. And I can certainly see in all of your writing, everything you do, you really are trying to make a difference for the good too. So I really have enjoyed this conversation with you tonight.
Yeah, me too. And I will continue whenever an ASD3 family comes to me. I will continue sending them towards you guys as I have been for the past few years.
Thank you.